This idyllic little eyesore is about to become the centerpiece of our new community wellness trail, Mr. Evans. The HOA has already approved the preliminary budget for the footbridge. Your cooperation is expected, not requested. The voice belonged to Karen Miller, the recently self-appointed empress of our neighborhood, and it had the grating quality of gravel being ground under a sensible heel. She stood on my lawn, a good 10 feet inside my property line, flanked by two nervous-looking men holding surveying equipment. Her plus-size frame was squeezed into a lemon-yellow pantsuit that screamed authority, or at least a desperate desire for it. She held a clipboard like a royal scepter and pointed its corner toward the gentle slope of my land that ran down to the whispering waters of Elm Creek. The very reason I'd bought this property in the first place. My property. The words seemed to have no meaning to her. She thrust a piece of paper at me, a freshly printed violation notice. The charge? Unmaintained natural overgrowth. She was fining me for the ancient willows and native river birches that had stood sentinel over that creek for longer than our subdivision or even our town had existed. She was fining me for the very soul of my land. If you believe that a person's home is their castle and that property rights are sacred, then stick around. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to hear your own HOA horror stories. We're all in this fight together against the Karens of the world. Now let me tell you exactly how I took a woman who weaponized bylaws and buried her under the full weight of laws she never even knew existed. This all started not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping rot. I'm Sergeant Major Marcus Evans, United States Army, retired. After 25 years of service, moving from one side of the globe to the other, all my wife Sarah and I wanted was peace. We found it here, on a 5-acre plot nestled at the edge of the Oak Creek Meadows subdivision. The key feature, the non-negotiable element of our search, was the creek. The property line on the plat survey, the deed, and the county records was crystal clear. It ran directly to the geographical center of Elm Creek. That water, those trees, that sacred strip of earth was not a view. It was my backyard. It was the place I went to decompress, to feel the solid ground under my feet and remember what it was we fought for. For the first few years, life was exactly that. Peaceful. The HOA was a benign entity, a necessary evil that ensured nobody painted their house purple or left a rusted-out car on their lawn. The meetings were sleepy affairs, concerned with the annual budget for mowing the entrance median and planning the neighborhood block party. Then came Karen Miller. She moved in 3 years ago, a recent divorcee with too much time on her hands and a deep, unquenchable thirst for control. She saw the HOA not as a service, but as a throne. Her campaign for the presidency was a masterclass in petty tyranny. She walked the neighborhood with a measuring tape, citing people for grass that was a quarter-inch too high. She created new rules out of thin air, leveraging the apathy of most residents to push her agenda. The old, reasonable board members, retired folks who just wanted to serve their community, were either bullied into resigning or simply gave up, worn down by her relentless, exhausting onslaught of procedural nonsense. She stacked the board with her hand-picked sycophants, and within a year, Oak Creek Meadows had transformed from a community into her personal fiefdom. We'd received a few of her ridiculous notices before. One for our trash cans being visible from the street for 2 hours after the garbage truck had come. Another for a small flag from my old unit hanging by the garage door. I'd paid the small fines just to make her go away, a mistake I now see in hindsight. It was like paying tribute to a warlord. It only confirmed her power and emboldened her to demand more. But this was different. This wasn't about a trash can or a flag. She was standing on my land with hired men, declaring her intention to seize it, to pave over my sanctuary and call it community wellness. She mistook my silence for weakness. She mistook my calm for acquiescence. After 25 years in the Army, I've learned that the loudest person in the room is often the most insecure. My calmness wasn't fear. It was the quiet, cold process of threat assessment. And in that moment, I assessed Karen Miller not as a neighborhood nuisance, but as a hostile force, an enemy combatant standing on my soil. And I knew, with the certainty of a well-aimed rifle, that I was going to dismantle her entire empire, one meticulously documented step at a time. The battle for Elm Creek had just begun. My first response was measured, a deliberate display of calm that I knew would infuriate her more than any shouting match could. I took a slow breath, letting the cool morning air settle me, and looked from her smug face to the two surveyors who were now actively avoiding my gaze, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. "Karen," I began, my voice even and low, "you and these gentlemen are trespassing. This is private property." I gestured toward the creek bank she had so casually condemned. "That land, from this survey stake right down to the middle of that water, belongs to me. It's on the deed you should have received when you bought your house, and it's on the official plat map filed with the county. I suggest you and your crew remove yourselves from my property immediately." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a condescending smirk. This was the part she enjoyed, the challenge, the opportunity to exert her authority. She puffed out her chest, the polyester of her jacket straining at the buttons. "Oh, Marcus, don't be so dramatic," she clucked, waving her clipboard dismissively. "We're all part of a community here, and the HOA covenants, which you agreed to when you purchased your home, give the board broad powers for community betterment." She flipped through her papers, brandishing a page filled with dense legalese. Article 9, Section 4, Common View Properties. It states that any area visible from common spaces must be maintained to community standards and can be utilized for approved projects that enhance the value and wellness of all residents. It was utter nonsense, a grotesque misinterpretation of a boilerplate clause, but she delivered it with the unshakable conviction of a zealot. She was counting on me being intimidated by the official-looking document, by the jargon she was spewing. "The Beautification Committee, which I chair, of course, has determined that this overgrown mess," she sneered, gesturing at the beautiful Wild Creek bank, "is a blight. We'll be bringing in a crew in 2 weeks to begin clearing it for the trail. This fine," she tapped the violation notice against my chest, "is just the beginning. If you don't start clearing it yourself, the fines will become daily, and we will place a lien on your property for the cost of the professional clearing. We expect your full cooperation." I didn't take the paper. I just looked at her, my expression unreadable. She mistook my discipline for defeat. With a final, triumphant sniff, she turned on her heel and marched back toward the street, her surveyors scurrying after her like well-trained poodles. I watched them go, the violation notice lying where it had fallen on my welcome mat. That afternoon, I went to my study and began my counteroffensive. The first step was formal and official. I typed a letter addressed to Karen Miller and every single member of the HOA board individually. It was professional, devoid of emotion, and legally precise. In it, I referenced my property deed, the specific lot number, when the county plat map number. I attached a high-quality copy of my official survey with the property line clearly highlighted. I quoted the relevant sections of state property law regarding trespass. I formally stated that they, their agents, or their contractors were forbidden from entering my property. I concluded by stating that any attempt to enter my land or alter it in any way would be met with immediate and robust legal action, for which they would be held personally and corporately liable. I sent each letter via certified mail with a return receipt requested. There would be no plausible deniability. They would not be able to say they weren't warned. A week later, their response arrived. It was printed on the official HOA letterhead, but Karen's rhetorical fingerprints were all over it. The tone was patronizing, a masterclass in passive-aggressive corporate speak. It thanked me for my correspondence, but informed me that their legal counsel, which I suspected was a cut-rate attorney who gave them a bulk deal on boilerplate letters, had reviewed my claim and found it without merit. They doubled down, accusing me of harboring anti-community sentiment and of hoarding a natural resource that belongs to everyone. The letter ended with a new threat. Failure to comply with the Wellness Trail Initiative will result in the aforementioned fines and a lien being placed against your property. We have scheduled the initial clearing for Monday, the 24th. They even had the audacity to include a crudely drawn map, a red dotted line slicing through the diagram of my property with a little cartoon drawing of a smiling stick figure walking next to the creek. They thought this was a game of paper. They had no idea that for a man who had spent his career planning campaigns and managing logistics, paperwork wasn't a threat, it was a battleground. And on this ground, I was prepared to build a fortress of facts and law that their flimsy binder of rules couldn't possibly breach. They had fired their warning shot. Now it was time for me to start sighting in my own artillery. The first rule of any engagement is to know your enemy and know the terrain. For me, the terrain wasn't just my 5 acres. It was the entire legal and procedural framework of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. Karen thought her binder of bylaws was a shield. I was about to turn it into a cage. I spent the next few days conducting what amounted to opposition research. I drove to the county records office and pulled the HOA's original articles of incorporation and the Master Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, or CC&Rs, filed when the subdivision was first created 20 years ago. I paid for certified copies of everything. Then I leveraged the state's open records laws for homeowners associations, submitting a formal, notarized request for the complete minutes of every board meeting for the past 5 years, all financial statements, and copies of all vendor contracts. They were legally obligated to comply within 30 days. While I waited for that treasure trove of information, I started building my own intelligence network. I began taking walks around the neighborhood, not with a clipboard, but with a friendly wave and a listening ear. I started talking to my neighbors, really talking to them, for the first time since I'd moved in. I discovered I wasn't the only one suffocating under Karen's reign. I found a pattern. Her targets were almost always the same: new families who didn't know the rules yet, or elderly residents on fixed incomes who were easily intimidated. She had forced one older gentleman, a retired history teacher named Mr. Henderson, to rip out a beautiful, historically accurate colonial-style garden he'd spent years cultivating because the flowers weren't on her approved flora list. She'd hounded a young couple, the Garcias, with weekly fines until they took down their children's swing set, claiming its cedar wood clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to establish dominance. Each small victory fueled her ego and solidified her control. She was a classic bully, but her weapon of choice wasn't her fists, it was paperwork and public shaming. While the documents trickled in, I made a phone call that would change the entire trajectory of this conflict. I called David Shen. David and I had served together in the same brigade. He was a sharp, no-nonsense officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army's legal arm. After he left the service, he'd opened a boutique law firm specializing in real estate and property law. He was exactly the kind of ally I needed: disciplined, strategic, and utterly ruthless when it came to defending a just cause. I laid out the whole situation for him over the phone. I could almost hear him smiling through the receiver. A power-mad HOA president trying to seize a veteran's land using a bastardized interpretation of the covenants? He said, "Marcus, this is the kind of case I dream about. Send me everything you have. Your deed, the survey, her letters, all of it. And in the meantime, I want you to look up something for me. Research the term riparian rights as it applies to our state law. I have a hunch Karen Miller has never heard of it, and it's about to become her worst nightmare." I hung up the phone and dove into legal research with the same focus I once applied to battle plans. And what I found was pure gold. Riparian rights are a system of water law that gives the owner of land bordering a river or stream, the riparian owner, rights to the water and the land beneath it. For a non-navigable waterway like Elm Creek, the law in our state was unequivocal. My property ownership didn't stop at the water's edge. It extended to the Thalweg, the precise geographical center line of the creek. I owned the bank. I owned the slope. I owned the rocks and the soil under the water. These rights were not granted by a deed or a covenant. They were fundamental common law rights that predated the very existence of the state, let alone the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. An HOA covenant could dictate the color of my mailbox, but it could no more strip me of my riparian rights than it could repeal the law of gravity. It was the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. When I presented my findings to David, he was ecstatic. "This is it, Marcus," he said, his voice crackling with energy. "This is the kill shot. She's been fighting you on the battlefield of her own choosing, the bylaws. We're about to move the conflict to a place where her rules are meaningless. Together, we drafted our response. It wasn't just a letter, it was a legal broadside. David composed a formal cease and desist that was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It cited, with precise numbering, the specific state statutes governing riparian rights, criminal trespass, and liability for property damage. It laid out in excruciating detail the legal consequences for Karen and for each board member personally if they proceeded. It demanded they immediately rescind the fine and all threats of a lien. The letter concluded with a simple, chilling statement. Be advised that any further communication on this matter should be directed to my legal counsel. Govern yourselves accordingly. We sent it via courier to Karen's house and emailed copies to every board member. The paper war had just escalated dramatically, and I had just deployed a weapon they didn't even know existed. The cease and desist letter landed in the HOA leadership circle with the force of a stun grenade. The predictable silence that followed was telling. I knew from a sympathetic neighbor on the board, one of the few holdovers from the pre-Karen era who had been cowed into submission, that my letter had triggered a full-blown panic. The board convened an emergency executive session. My source, a quiet woman named Brenda, texted me a summary of the meeting. The board's cut-rate lawyer had apparently confirmed that riparian rights were in fact a real thing and that my position was legally unassailable. He strongly advised them to stand down, rescind the fines, and issue a formal apology. Any other course of action, he warned, would expose the HOA to a lawsuit it would almost certainly lose, along with significant financial damages. But Karen Miller was not a woman who retreated. To do so would be to admit error, to show weakness. Her power was built on an edifice of unshakable, righteous certainty. Brenda reported that Karen flew into a rage, accusing her own lawyer of being incompetent and me of using fancy legal tricks to intimidate them. She painted me as a selfish, wealthy elitist, ironic given her own lifestyle, who was trying to bully the simple, community-minded folks on the board. She declared my lawyer's letter a bluff. He's just trying to scare us, she'd shouted. He won't actually sue. It's too expensive. We press forward. The community is behind us. She managed to rally her core group of loyalists, and they voted to ignore their lawyer's advice. This was a critical mistake on her part, a classic case of a commander letting ego override intelligence. Instead of a strategic retreat, she ordered a full frontal assault on the social front. The next edition of the Oak Creek Meadows monthly newsletter, the Oak Leaf, arrived in my mailbox a few days later. On the front page was a thinly veiled editorial written by Karen herself titled, On Community Spirit and Shared Blessings. It spoke of the beautiful natural resources our neighborhood was blessed with and lamented the selfishness of a few individuals who sought to hoard these treasures for themselves, denying their neighbors the simple pleasure of a walk in nature. It didn't mention me by name, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. She was trying to isolate me, to paint me as the villain in her carefully constructed narrative. It was a classic smear campaign, and it was a massive miscalculation. Because it brought the fight out of the boardroom and into the light, her clumsy propaganda piece had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of isolating me, it activated the silent majority of residents who had been individually bullied by her for years. My phone started ringing. It was Mrs. Gable, a sweet widow in her late 70s. Her voice trembled with quiet anger as she told me how Karen had forced her to remove a small memorial bench she had placed under a cherry tree in her front yard, a tree she and her late husband had planted together. The bench, Karen had decreed, was not an approved landscape feature. Then I heard from the Garcias, the young couple with the wrong shade of brown swing set. They told me about the hundreds of dollars in fines they'd paid, money they couldn't really afford, just to get Karen off their back. The stories kept coming. A family fined because their basketball hoop was left out overnight. A man ordered to repaint his front door because the glossy finish was out of character with the neighborhood's rustic charm. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing a clear and disturbing pattern of abuse, harassment, and overreach. Karen hadn't been enforcing rules. She had been feeding her addiction to power. I realized this was bigger than my creek bank. This was about reclaiming our community from a petty dictator. I invited everyone who had called me, and a few others I knew were unhappy, to a meeting at my house that Thursday evening. I expected maybe 5 or 6 people. 22 showed up. They crowded into my living room, a diverse cross-section of our neighborhood. Young families, retirees, blue-collar workers, white-collar professionals. For 2 hours, they shared their stories, their voices a mixture of anger, frustration, and for the first time, hope. The energy in the room was palpable. They realized they weren't alone. They had been systematically intimidated, but united, they were strong. By the end of the night, we had formed the Oak Creek Meadows Concerned Homeowners Committee. We had a shared email list, a private social media group, and a mission. I was unanimously elected as their spokesperson, and David Chen, who had joined the meeting via video call, was formally adopted as our pro bono legal counsel. Karen thought she was fighting a war against one stubborn veteran. She was about to find out she had declared war on her entire community. We weren't just going to defend, we were going to liberate. Our strategy, devised by David with military precision, was a classic rope-a-dope. We knew Karen's ego was her greatest weakness. If we pushed back too hard, too publicly, she might be forced by a panicked board to back down. But if we let her believe she was winning, if we dangled the prospect of a final, glorious victory just within her reach, she would inevitably overextend herself and walk right into our trap. We needed her to commit an act so blatant, so legally indefensible, that the entire community, and more importantly, the HOA's insurance company, would have no choice but to turn on her. The plan required patience and a steady hand, qualities I had in abundance. The first move was to send one last, formal communication. David drafted a letter that was a masterwork of deceptive conciliation. It was addressed to the board and began by expressing disappointment at the current impasse. It politely reiterated my legal position on the riparian rights, but this time it included an offer. In the interest of resolving this matter amicably and educating the board on a complex area of property law, Mr. Evans is willing to pay for a 3-hour consultation with a neutral, third-party real estate law expert of the board's choosing to provide a definitive legal opinion on the matter of riparian boundaries and HOA authority. It was a generous offer, designed to make her look unreasonable if she refused. The letter then pivoted. However, it continued, should the board choose to reject this offer and proceed with its planned incursion, please be advised that this will be viewed as a willful and malicious act of criminal trespass and destruction of property. We will seek immediate injunctive relief and file a civil suit for the full cost of property restoration, all associated legal fees, and significant punitive damages. Furthermore, any equipment, vehicles, or materials brought onto Mr. Evans' private property for this purpose will be considered abandoned and will be legally seized and impounded at the owner's expense. We sent the letter and waited. The bait was in the water. As expected, Karen swallowed it whole. The next HOA monthly meeting was held in the clubhouse. Several members of our newly formed committee attended, phones discreetly recording audio from their pockets. According to their reports, it was Karen's finest hour. She stood at the podium, holding our letter aloft for all to see. She didn't read the part about our offer to educate them. Instead, she cherry-picked the warnings, twisting them into evidence of my aggression. "Look at this," she announced, her voice dripping with mock outrage. "Mr. Evans is threatening us now. He's threatening to steal our contractor's equipment. He thinks these legal scare tactics, this mumbo-jumbo about riparian rights, will stop us from building a beautiful walking path for your children and grandchildren to enjoy. He is trying to bully your HOA board." She paused for dramatic effect, scanning the faces of her supporters. "Well, I am here to tell you that we will not be bullied. This is our community. Progress will not be stopped by the selfishness of one man. The bulldozers start clearing that path on Monday morning, as scheduled." The room, packed with her allies, erupted in applause. It was all there, on multiple audio recordings. Her public declaration of intent to commit a crime, her admission that she had received and understood our legal warnings, and her malicious misrepresentation of our attempts to resolve the issue peacefully. The trap was now perfectly set and baited. All that was left was for the prey to walk into it. I spent that weekend making my final preparations. I went to an electronics store and bought 4 high-definition, weatherproof security cameras with motion detection and night vision. I mounted them strategically on trees, perfectly camouflaged, creating an overlapping field of view that covered every square inch of the creek bank and the property line. I printed 24 new signs on heavy-duty plastic. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Oak Creek Meadows HOA is not permitted entry. I hammered them into the ground every 10 feet along my property line, creating an unambiguous visual barrier. My final call was to the county sheriff's department. I didn't file a complaint. That would have been premature. I simply asked to speak to the on-duty patrol sergeant. I introduced myself, gave him my address, and explained that I was in a civil dispute with my HOA and that they had threatened to bring heavy equipment onto my land on Monday morning, despite repeated warnings from my attorney. I gave him David Chen's name and number and calmly stated that while I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, I might have to call to report a criminal trespass in progress. The sergeant was professional and thanked me for the heads up. This call was crucial. It created a preemptive, informal record of the situation. When the call came on Monday, they wouldn't be responding to a simple neighbor dispute. They would be responding to a situation they had already been briefed on, involving a landowner who had done everything by the book. The cameras were rolling. The signs were up. The law was on my side, and the authorities were on notice. The stage was set for Karen Miller's final performance. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of beautiful, peaceful day that made you want to just sit by the creek and listen to the world wake up. But peace was not on the day's agenda. At precisely 8 a.m., just as Karen had promised, the rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the neighborhood. A large flatbed truck carrying a small but brutally effective-looking bulldozer lumbered down the street and then hissed to a stop in front of my house. It was followed by a white pickup truck with Miller Landscaping on the side. No relation to Karen, just an unfortunate coincidence for the poor contractor who was about to have a very bad day. And bringing up the rear, in her sensible beige sedan, was Karen herself. She emerged from her car wearing a fluorescent yellow safety vest over a floral blouse, a ridiculous combination that made her look like a deranged crossing guard. She was holding her clipboard of destiny, a grim, satisfied smile plastered on her face. This was her moment of triumph. I was waiting for them. I stood on my lawn just inside the line of no trespassing signs, a mug of coffee in my hand. I was calm. My heart rate was steady. This was not a confrontation to be feared. It was a procedure to be executed. From our front porch, my wife Sarah was recording the entire scene on her phone. 2 houses down, mister. Henderson was meticulously watering his non-compliant roses, his own phone propped up on his garden gnome, its lens aimed our way. Across the street, the Garcias were suddenly very interested in checking their mail, holding a phone at a casual angle. We had witnesses, we had cameras, we had a plan. I met Karen at the property line, marked clearly by a surveyor's stake and my row of signs. The bulldozer operator, a grizzled man in his 60s, had already started unchaining his machine. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I am informing you and your contractor for the final time. You are forbidden from entering my property. Order your men to pack up their equipment and leave now." Karen actually laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Don't be so ridiculous, Marcus. This is official HOA business. You're delaying progress." She turned to the bulldozer operator, who had paused, looking uncertainly between the two of us. "Go ahead, Frank. Start by clearing those ugly bushes right there." She pointed a manicured finger at a beautiful cluster of native viburnum near the property line. I held up my hand, not in a threatening way, but as a clear signal to stop. I looked directly at the operator, Frank. "Sir," I said, "this is my private property. My attorney has informed this woman and the HOA board that entering this land is criminal trespass. If you cross that property line, you will be personally liable for any damages. I have multiple cameras recording this entire event. I strongly advise you to stay on the public right-of-way." Frank hesitated, his hand on the lever. He looked at Karen, who was now fuming. "Don't listen to him," she shrieked. "He's bluffing. The HOA is your client. We will cover any liability. Do your job." Her ego had completely taken over. She could not stand being defied. especially not in front of a contractor. She had to prove she was in charge. That was the fatal flaw I had counted on. Frank, caught between a rock and a hard place, made the wrong choice. He shrugged, climbed into his cab, and fired up the engine. The bulldozer lurched forward. The moment its metal tracks bit into my lawn, tearing a muddy scar in the green grass, I spoke again, my voice ringing with a new authority. That's it. You've just committed criminal trespass and destruction of property. I raised my own phone, which was already connected. I am on a live call with the county sheriff's dispatch. A patrol car is already on its way. I suggest you shut down that machine. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in Karen's eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by her arrogance. The sheriff, she scoffed. The sheriff can't stop an official HOA project. They have no jurisdiction over covenant matters. The bulldozer moved another few feet, its blade lowering and crushing a young dogwood sapling Sarah and I had planted last year. A pang of anger shot through me, but I kept my composure. Right on cue, the distant wail of a siren grew closer. 2 minutes later, a county sheriff's patrol car, followed by a second, pulled up, its lights flashing silently in the morning sun. The lead deputy who stepped out was a tall, imposing man with a calm demeanor. It was Sergeant Miller, again, no relation, the very same man I had spoken to over the weekend. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. The bulldozer on my lawn, the torn-up turf, the crushed tree, my line of signs, and Karen standing there in her absurd vest. He walked over to me first. "Mr. Evans?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant," I replied. "Thank you for the quick response." He nodded, then turned his attention to Karen, who was already marching toward him, her HOA binder held out like a shield. "Officer, I am Karen Miller, president of the Oak Creek Meadows HOA," she began, her voice full of self-importance. "This is a sanctioned community project. This man is interfering." Sergeant Miller completely ignored her extended binder. His eyes were fixed on the bulldozer, then on the damage. He walked over to Frank, who had wisely shut off the engine. "Sir, I need to see your driver's license and the registration and insurance for this vehicle," he said, his voice flat and professional. He then turned back to Karen, his expression now utterly devoid of patience. "Ma'am, I am not here to interpret your HOA covenants. I am here because a vehicle has been driven onto private property, past clearly posted signs, and has caused damage. That is a crime. You are the person who ordered him to do it. You are facilitating criminal trespass and vandalism. You will order this machine off this man's property immediately, or you will be placed under arrest for obstruction." The color drained from Karen's face. Her entire world of make-believe authority had just collided with the hard, cold reality of actual law enforcement. The public humiliation was devastating. Neighbors had come out of their houses and were watching from their driveways. The Garcias and Mr. Henderson were no longer pretending to do other things. They were openly recording. Karen's reign of terror had just ended, not with a vote, but with the quiet, firm voice of a county sheriff on a sunny Monday morning. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos for Karen and her crumbling empire. The landscaping contractor, Frank, now realizing the depth of the legal jeopardy he'd been placed in, was profusely apologetic. Sergeant Miller issued him a citation for trespassing and filed a formal incident report detailing the property damage, a report that named Karen Miller as the individual who directed the action. Frank and his crew, eager to extricate themselves from the situation, packed up their bulldozer and left, but not before David Chen, who had arrived on scene within minutes of my call, got a signed statement from him and copies of his business license and insurance information. The contractor's company was now a key witness for our side. That very afternoon, David filed for an emergency temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction in county court. Given the irrefutable evidence, the video footage from multiple angles, the sheriff's report, and our documented history of warnings, the judge granted it without hesitation. The HOA, and Karen Miller by name, were now legally barred from setting foot on, let alone altering, any part of my property. A copy of the court order was posted on the community clubhouse door, but we were just getting started. The injunction was defense. It was time to go on the attack. 2 days later, David filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit. We didn't just sue the Oak Creek Meadows HOA as an entity. We named Karen Miller and every single board member who voted with her, personally. This was the critical strategic move. Suing the HOA would get the attention of their insurance company. Suing the board members personally would make them understand that they could not hide behind the corporate veil of the association. Their own homes, their own assets were now on the line. The lawsuit had multiple counts. For the HOA, we sued for trespass, destruction of private property, and breach of fiduciary duty, arguing the board had acted negligently and against the community's best interests. For Karen and the individual board members, we added a count of tortious interference, a legal claim arguing that they had intentionally and maliciously acted outside the scope of their authority, knowing their actions would cause harm and expose the association to liability. We sought monetary damages for the full cost of landscape restoration by a top-tier firm, the cost of a new official survey to document the incursion for the court record, all of David's legal fees, which were substantial, and, most importantly, punitive damages to punish the willful and malicious nature of their actions. The filing of the lawsuit triggered a contractual obligation for the HOA to notify its directors and officers, D&O, liability insurance carrier. This is where the real leverage came into play. The insurance company wasn't interested in Karen's ego or her vision for a wellness trail. They were interested in one thing: minimizing their financial exposure. They immediately assigned an investigator to the case. David promptly sent him our entire evidence package: copies of the certified letters, the audio recordings from the HOA meeting where Karen mocked our warnings, the crystal clear videos of the trespass, the sheriff's report, and the signed statement from the contractor. The evidence was so overwhelming, so damning, that the insurance company's response was swift and brutal. They sent a reservation of rights letter to the HOA board. It's a standard legal document in such cases, but its implications were devastating. The letter essentially said that while the insurance company would provide a legal defense for the HOA as an organization, they were reserving the right to deny coverage for any damages awarded as a result of intentional, criminal, or fraudulent acts by the board members. In plain English, the insurance company was telling the board, "Your president knowingly broke the law after being warned not to by her own attorney and the homeowner's attorney. We will defend the lawsuit, but if you lose because of her malicious actions, you and the homeowners might be on the hook for the damages yourselves." The letter was a tactical nuke dropped into the middle of the HOA boardroom. The sycophantic board members who had blindly followed Karen were suddenly faced with the terrifying prospect of having their wages garnished or liens placed on their own homes to pay a massive legal judgment. Their loyalty to Karen evaporated overnight, replaced by a desperate, panicked sense of self-preservation. The foundation of her power, which was built on bullying and bluffing, had been shattered by the one thing she couldn't control: real-world financial consequences. The legal trap had been sprung, and now the reversal of power was truly in motion. The reservation of rights letter from the insurance company was the catalyst that transformed a legal dispute into a community-wide revolution. The board members, now staring into a personal financial abyss, turned on Karen with the ferocity of cornered animals. The details of the letter and the potential for a massive special assessment to be levied on every single homeowner to pay for a lawsuit the HOA was guaranteed to lose began to leak out. Panic spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. This was the moment our Concerned Homeowners Committee had been waiting for. We had the law on our side, and now we had the powerful motivator of financial fear on our side as well. We decided to force a public reckoning. Using a provision in the HOA bylaws, the very documents Karen had once wielded like a weapon, we gathered signatures from more than 25% of the homeowners to call for a special meeting of the membership. The board was legally obligated to schedule it. We didn't hold the meeting in the small, easily controlled clubhouse. We rented the auditorium at the local middle school. We advertised it with flyers on every mailbox, with posts in the neighborhood social media groups, and with a formal notice sent by our committee. We promised a presentation on the lawsuit threatening our property values. We knew Karen would be there. We knew she would try to control the narrative. We were prepared. The night of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. Over 200 homeowners were in attendance, their faces a mixture of anxiety, confusion, and anger. The atmosphere was electric. The interim board sat at a table on the stage, looking pale and nervous. Karen, ever defiant, sat with them, though she had been stripped of her role as spokesperson for this meeting. I took the podium first. I didn't shout. I didn't use inflammatory language. I simply and methodically laid out the facts. I presented a timeline of events, starting with Karen's initial demand and ending with the lawsuit. I put my certified mail receipts up on the projector screen. I played the audio clip from the HOA meeting where Karen dismissed the legal warnings and promised the bulldozers would roll. Then I played the video. On the huge screen behind me, the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the bulldozer tore into my lawn, as Karen berated the contractor, and as the sheriff's deputies arrived. The visual evidence was visceral and undeniable. David Chen then took the stage. He didn't speak in legalese. He spoke to them as a fellow homeowner. He explained the concept of riparian rights in simple, clear terms. He explained the meaning of tortious interference. Then he put up a redacted copy of the reservation of rights letter from the insurance company. He explained exactly what it meant, that the insurance company believed the board had acted in bad faith, and that the financial burden of their recklessness could fall on every single person in that room. "This isn't about a walking path anymore," David concluded, his voice resonating through the silent auditorium. "This is about a board that has acted with gross negligence. It's about a president who has exposed every one of you to a massive financial liability because of her personal vendetta." When he finished, the floor was open for questions, and the dam broke. But the questions weren't for me or David. They were for Karen. One after another, homeowners stood up and confronted her. But it wasn't just about the creek. It was about everything. Gable, her voice shaking but strong, stood up and told the entire community about her memorial bench. The Garcias stood up and talked about the swing set. A dozen other stories, a dozen other examples of petty tyranny and abuse of power poured out. It was a public airing of grievances, a collective catharsis for a community that had been silenced for too long. The pattern of abuse was laid bare for everyone to see, right there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the school auditorium. Karen tried to fight back. She blustered, she interrupted, she accused people of lying, but her power was gone. The crowd wasn't cheering for her anymore. They were heckling her, demanding she answer for her actions. Finally, Mr. Henderson, the quiet history teacher, stood up. "According to Article 3, Section 2 of our bylaws," he said, his voice calm but firm, "a vote of no confidence in the president and the entire board of directors can be called by a majority vote of a quorum of members at a special meeting." A murmur went through the crowd. He continued, "I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Miller and the entire board that supported her reckless and financially irresponsible actions." Someone else immediately seconded the motion. A vote was called. It wasn't even close. A sea of hands went up in favor of the motion. When the call came for those opposed, only a handful of Karen's most loyal cronies raised their hands. It was a landslide, an overwhelming public repudiation. Karen sat on the stage, her face ashen. Her empire, built on paper and fear, had been dismantled in a public forum by the very people she sought to rule. She had been stripped of her title, her power, and her dignity in one swift, democratic blow. In the wake of the public spectacle, the path to resolution was swift and decisive. An interim board was immediately elected from the floor, comprised of respected community members, including the unflappable Mr. Henderson and the determined Mrs. Gable. Their first official act, conducted the very next morning, was to call David Chen and request a settlement meeting. We met in a neutral conference room at David's office. The tone was entirely different. There was no arrogance, no condescension. The new board members were somber, practical, and deeply apologetic. They understood the gravity of the situation, and their primary goal was to staunch the bleeding and begin the process of healing the community. The settlement negotiations were straightforward. Our terms were firm but fair. First, the HOA would pay for the complete restoration of my property, not by a cheap landscaping crew, but by a top-tier environmental design firm that specialized in native creek bank restoration. Second, the HOA would pay every penny of my legal fees. Third, the HOA would issue a formal front-page apology to me and my family in the next issue of the Oak Leaf newsletter, admitting their error and clarifying the legal precedent of riparian rights for all homeowners. Fourth, they would consent to a permanent injunction being recorded in the county land records and incorporated into the HOA's master charter, explicitly recognizing and protecting the riparian rights of all properties bordering Elm Creek, ensuring this could never happen again. Finally, the lawsuit against the HOA itself would be dropped. The new board agreed to all terms without hesitation. However, the lawsuit against Karen Miller and the other ousted board members personally remained active. This was a crucial point for me. It was never about the money, it was about accountability. The organization had been corrected, but the individuals who drove it off a cliff needed to face personal consequences for their actions. The other board members, abandoned by the HOA's insurance and facing their own legal bills, quickly settled for nominal amounts, eager to put the nightmare behind them. Karen, however, refused. Her pride wouldn't let her. She hired her own lawyer and tried to fight, but the mountain of evidence against her was insurmountable. After a few months of costly legal maneuvering, facing a certain loss in court, her own attorney advised her to settle. She was forced to write a substantial check, paid out of her own pocket for punitive damages. That was the justice I had been seeking. The symbolic final confrontation wasn't in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened a few weeks later on a quiet Saturday morning. The restoration of my creek bank was underway. A team of professionals was carefully planting native grasses and young saplings, healing the scar the bulldozer had left. I was down by the water, helping to place some river stones when I saw her. Karen was walking on the public sidewalk across the street, loading groceries into her car. She had lost weight. Her usually immaculate hair was unkempt. She saw me. Our eyes met across the distance. In that moment, I saw no fight, no smugness, no defiance. All I saw was a hollowed-out bitterness and the deep, weary shame of a person who had lost everything that mattered to him. She couldn't hold my gaze. She looked away first, slammed her trunk shut, and hurried into her car, driving away without a backward glance. There was nothing left to say. Her power had been a costume, and the community had stripped it from her, leaving her exposed and small. The final act was to close the circle. I took the entire sum of the punitive damages I received from Karen's settlement and made a donation to Helmets to Hard Hats, a charity that helps veterans transition into careers in the construction trades. I made the donation in the name of the Oak Creek Meadows community. The new board, at my request, published a small notice about the donation in the newsletter. It was the final, quiet nail in the coffin of her reputation, transforming the money born from her malice into something positive that honored service and community, the very things she had tried to corrupt. The war was over. The peace had been won. The restoration of my property was more than just replanting grass and trees. It was a symbol of the entire community's recovery. The new HOA board, led by the thoughtful Mr. Henderson, began a systematic overhaul of the association's governing documents. They worked with a reputable law firm to review and revise the bylaws, focusing on eliminating the vague, ambiguous clauses that Karen had so effectively weaponized. Phrases like community betterment and neighborhood aesthetic were either removed or strictly defined to prevent future abuse. They instituted new rules requiring a community-wide vote for any project exceeding a modest budget, ensuring that the homeowners, not a small cabal on the board, would have the final say on how their money was spent. Transparency became their mantra. All meetings were recorded and the minutes were posted online for everyone to see. The era of secret executive sessions and backroom deals was over. Interestingly, the idea of a wellness trail was not abandoned, but this time it was approached with respect and common sense. A new planning committee was formed, and they asked me to be a part of it. I agreed. Working together, we identified a large tract of actual, undisputed common land at the other end of the neighborhood. We designed a beautiful, meandering path that respected property lines and enhanced the natural landscape without infringing on anyone's rights. Volunteers from the community, including me and the Garcias, spent several weekends clearing brush and laying mulch. It became a project that brought people together, a source of shared pride rather than a point of division. The community that emerged from the conflict was stronger, more connected, and more engaged than it had ever been before. People who had barely known their neighbors' names were now stopping to chat on the street. The annual block party that year had the highest attendance in its history. We had faced a common enemy, And in doing so, we had rediscovered our common identity. The fear that Karen had cultivated for so long had been replaced by a sense of shared ownership and empowerment. The final scene of this long drama played out not with a bang, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. A few months after the settlement, on a warm summer evening, Sarah and I took 2 chairs down to our fully restored creek bank. The new dogwood tree was thriving. The native grasses swayed gently in the breeze. The scar from the bulldozer was gone, replaced by a lush carpet of green. We sat there for a long time, watching the clear water of Elm Creek flow over the rocks, the sound a soothing murmur. The peace we had sought when we bought this land had finally returned. But it was a different kind of peace now. It wasn't the passive, quiet peace of isolation. It was an earned peace, a peace that had been fought for, defended, and secured. It was a peace built on the foundation of justice and community. I thought about the lessons learned, not just in some far-off desert, but right here in my own backyard. Freedom isn't just an abstract concept defended by armies on a grand scale. It's something that has to be protected every day, in small ways. It's about defending your small patch of earth, your rights and your dignity from those, big or small, who believe their ambition gives them the right to trample over yours. It's about understanding that the law is a shield for the prepared, not just a sword for the powerful. It's about having the discipline to stand your ground, the intelligence to know the rules of engagement better than your opponent, and the courage to see the fight through to the end. The creek flowed on, indifferent to our struggles, a timeless reminder that nature endures. And in that moment, I knew we would too, a little stronger, a little wiser, and a lot more grateful for the simple, hard-won sanctuary of home.